It was Laura Whitmore's first morning as the official chief operating officer of a fintech company in New York. She didn't sit through introductory meetings or wait for reports from her subordinates. She chose to walk straight down to the internal trading floor, where every dollar of the company's money was flowing in real time. Cold, white light washed over rows of screens dense with data. The numbers updated constantly, without a moment's rest. And then she stopped, right in the middle of the most critical transaction control area. A man was slumped over his desk. His shirt was wrinkled, a cold cup of coffee beside him, his hands still resting near the keyboard as if he hadn't had time to move. His name was Daniel Reeves. Laura didn't ask. She didn't look closely at the surrounding screens, and she didn't give him a chance to explain. Her husband did not, but if someone had been watching from the perspective of those screens, they would have seen something Laura missed. In a small corner of the system, a faint warning message was flashing, repeating, and then disappearing. Daniel wasn't exactly sleeping. He was waiting. When Laura said his name, Daniel jolted awake, his eyes heavy from lack of sleep, but sharp with a different kind of alertness. He opened his mouth, his voice hoarse. If anyone runs a full reset on the payment system, Laura cut him off immediately. In her eyes, it was just a flimsy excuse, and just a few minutes later, Daniel was asked to leave the building. No one asked what he was doing. No one asked how long he had been there. And no one knew that in that very moment, something massive had begun to slip out of control. After Daniel left the building, there was no immediate sign that anything had been interrupted. The trading floor continued its familiar rhythm. Streams of data kept flowing across the screens at a speed most people could only watch but never truly comprehend. And in the eyes of everyone present, Laura's decision didn't seem to have any immediate consequence big enough to make them pause and think twice. But what none of them knew, or rather hadn't yet realized, was that things had started to go off track 2 days earlier, during a period when the system looked perfectly stable on the surface. The first night, Daniel noticed something was wrong. It wasn't a clear moment of discovery. It was more of an unnameable feeling, like when you're so used to a steady rhythm that even the slightest skipped beat grabs your attention, even if you can't immediately explain what happened. He was monitoring international transactions moving through the payment system when he noticed a small group of transactions taking slightly longer to process than usual. Insignificant to an outsider, but enough to make someone like him, who was attuned to every minor fluctuation, stop and take a closer look. The discrepancy didn't trigger any errors. It didn't set off any system alerts. And it didn't cause a single transaction to be rejected. But it was precisely because it was so perfect at Daniel, an obvious problem that Daniel couldn't ignore it. He started pulling up the detailed logs, not because the system prompted him to, but because his professional instincts compelled him to look deeper into the things that others usually overlooked. One line of data appeared, then another. And as he pieced them together, he realized these transactions were completing all the proper validation steps, just like any other legitimate transfer, but their path through the system wasn't quite the same as the rest. By the second night, Daniel returned with the same suspicion. But this time he moved beyond simple observation and began to analyze things more systematically. He didn't filter the data by monetary value because the transactions weren't unusually large. He didn't filter by country because they came from various sources. And he didn't filter by account, as there was no sign of them targeting a specific destination. Instead, he focused on how the transactions moved through the system, tracking the individual processing steps that most people never look at, because they simply trust them to always work correctly. And that's where he began to see a repeating pattern. It wasn't frequent, but it was regular enough that it couldn't be random. There was a group of transactions, tiny compared to the total volume, that always passed through the same intermediary point before rejoining the main stream. And without monitoring it continuously, for a long enough period, no one would ever realize they were forming a meaningful sequence. What caught Daniel's attention wasn't the fact that these transactions were taking a different route, but how they did it without leaving a single trace to tip off the system. They weren't flagged as unusual, they weren't pulled for additional screening, and they weren't throttled the way standard defense mechanisms would treat anything suspicious. On paper, everything was valid. Within the system's logic, everything was right. But in the way they repeated the same pattern. Deliberate and controlled, Daniel realized he wasn't looking at a mere technical glitch. He sat motionless before his screen for much longer than usual, not because he was lost, but because he understood that what he was seeing could be far larger than what appeared on the surface. This wasn't the kind of attack people are usually trained to recognize. There were no massive surges, no pressure on the system, and no immediate destructive behavior. Instead, it looked like a long-term observation, where someone was patiently learning how the system breathed, testing every small step, checking every reaction, and recording everything to be used at a later time. Daniel began to trace deeper, following each transaction from its point of origin to completion, checking every authentication step, every state change, and every routing decision the system made. Everything looked perfect, until he hit a point he had never paid much attention to before. A minor service, sitting at the edge of the system architecture, built years ago and almost never maintained, because it rarely caused issues. Precisely because it never caused problems, it never got noticed, and because it was overlooked. It became the perfect place for something to pass through, undetected. Daniel understood something most technical manuals never say out loud. Large systems don't collapse because of obvious failure points, but because of small, forgotten parts left behind during long-term development. Parts where no one remembers exactly why they exist, but no one dares to remove them for fear of causing a bigger catastrophe. And right now, he was looking at one of those parts. He didn't report it immediately, not because he didn't grasp the gravity of the situation, but because he had seen warnings like this get delayed or downplayed, just because they came at the wrong time, especially when the company was gearing up for a major audit. Instead, he started doing what he knew he could do faster than any official process, building temporary control layers to monitor and limit what transactions could do what disrupting the entire system. He created shadow routing paths to trap suspicious transactions in an environment where he could observe them more clearly, while patching every small vulnerability he discovered as he tracked their behavior, all done live on a running system where every change had to be calculated perfectly. Because there was zero room for error, it wasn't a perfect solution, and Daniel knew that. But in a situation where he couldn't just shut down the system for a full inspection, it was the only way to keep things stable while tracking what was hiding underneath. Throughout those 2 days, no one truly understood what Daniel was doing. To those around him, he was just an analyst handling a minor technical issue, one of the many problems this complex system generated every single day. But for Daniel, he wasn't fixing a bug. He was trying to keep something that hadn't happened yet from happening at the exact moment it was waiting for. And that was exactly why. On the morning Laura saw him slumped over his desk, Daniel wasn't exactly sleeping the way she thought. He was in a state where his body could no longer hold up, but his mind was still clinging to a single assumption, that if someone accidentally deleted those temporary control layers he had built, everything wouldn't just go back to normal. It would shift into a much more dangerous state, something he didn't get to finish saying, and something no one in the room at that moment understood, was that this system wasn't just running. It was being watched, tested, and prepared for exploitation at a time when none of them would be ready, while the system continued to operate with an outward appearance of stability. And no one in the company truly understood what was happening beneath the surface. Daniel's life outside of work moved at a completely different pace. Slower, more mundane. The only place where he couldn't control everything with logic or experience, because there was no data, no logs, and no system to fix. Only promises he had tried to keep many times, but was always pulled away from by things no one else could see. That afternoon, in a small apartment in an unremarkable neighborhood, Ethan sat at the dining table with his notebook open, but his eyes weren't on the numbers. Instead, he kept glancing at the wall clock, where the minute hand drifted slowly in that way that makes a child realize time can be much longer when waiting for something important. Daniel walked into the house later than usual, his shirt still showing the wear of a long workday, his eyes not just tired but heavy, in a way only someone who hasn't slept for many consecutive hours could understand. And before he could say a word, Ethan looked up and asked in a voice that wasn't accusing, but clear enough that it couldn't be ignored. "You said you'd be there this time." The sentence wasn't long, it wasn't loud, but it carried a kind of pressure that no corporate meeting could ever create. Because it didn't come from job responsibility, but from a personal promise that Daniel knew very well he was on the verge of breaking once again. Daniel didn't answer right away, not because he didn't have one, but because any answer now wouldn't be good enough to make the situation better. And in that moment, caught between a system he knew was in a dangerous but unexploded state, and a son waiting for him to show up in the stands of a small soccer game, Daniel realized he didn't truly have a choice that didn't come with a cost. He only said he'd try, an answer he knew was vague, and Ethan nodded as if he were already used to that kind of response. He didn't react further or ask again, just turned back to his notebook, but the silence in the room then wasn't normal. It was a void that both understood but neither spoke of. Meanwhile, in another place, the system Daniel had just left didn't stop to wait for him. Transactions continued to flow. Data streams moved along paths he had begun to suspect, and even though he was at home, his mind kept returning to what he had seen over the last 2 days. Every pattern, every slight deviation, every detail that, if pieced together, would form a picture no one else in the company could see as clearly as he did. After dinner, once Ethan had gone back to his homework and the apartment returned to its familiar quiet, Daniel opened the old laptop he always brought home, connected to the system remotely, and returned to the data streams he hadn't finished analyzing. Not because he wanted to do extra work, but because he knew if he stopped, whatever was happening would continue without any oversight. He continued, patching the small vulnerabilities he found, step by step, not following a perfect plan but acting like someone trying to hold up a structure under internal pressure, redirecting suspicious transactions into a flow where he could observe them, keeping them in a range narrow enough to not affect the whole system, but clear enough for him to track their behavior. No one in the company knew he was doing this. No reports recorded it. There was no one behind him to support or double-check, and the only thing keeping everything from spiraling out of control right now was the persistence of a man whose name most people didn't even remember. Throughout all of this, Daniel didn't think about being recognized, nor did he think he was doing something grand. He just focused on one very simple, very heavy realization, that if what he was seeing was real, and if it developed the way he feared, the consequences wouldn't stop at numbers on a screen, but would bleed out to people who had no idea they were depending on a system they believed was safe. And right there, between two completely different worlds, a small apartment with a child waiting for his father to keep a promise, and a complex financial system being tested step by something invisible. Daniel stood at the center of a choice no one else in the company could see, a choice with no perfect option, only the least bad one. And he knew that any decision he made would leave a hole on the other side. Immediately after Daniel left the building, the internal operating system shifted into the mode it was always designed for in such situations. His access was revoked almost instantly, authentication tokens were invalidated, and everything he had built over the last 2 days, the temporary control layers that no one else understood, began to lose, the only anchor that kept them alive in an architecture that only accepted what was officially defined. No one actively deleted Daniel's work, but his removal from the system meant the code he wrote was no longer validated. The automated scripts following security protocols ceased to function. One by one, the layers of protection he had put in the right place at the right time vanished, leaving no clear sign they had ever existed to prevent something much larger from happening. On the surface, everything still looked stable in a way that gave no one a reason to be suspicious. The dashboards displayed no critical warnings. Performance metrics remained within acceptable ranges. And for the IT team on shift, the only thing they noticed was a slight slowdown in a few processing clusters, a familiar phenomenon in a complex, aging system. The decision was made quickly and decisively, just like dozens of times before. They executed a reset command to refresh the system's state, clear the memory, and resync services. It was a standard, safe procedure in almost any situation, and it had never caused serious consequences. In the first few minutes after the reset, everything went as expected. Latency dropped, queues were cleared, and transactions began processing faster. A sense of relief spread quickly through the control room, like a minor issue had been resolved before it could become a real concern. No one realized that this brief period wasn't stability. It was the last moment the system would appear normal. Immediately after, with Daniel's control layers gone, transactions that had once been held for monitoring began to move freely through previously restricted routes. This change didn't happen explosively. It unfolded silently, one transaction at a time, slow enough not to trigger any alarms, but deliberate enough to create a deviation that no one would notice right away. The transactions were still fully validated. The processing steps were still logged, and not a single line in the system indicated that an error had occurred. But the final outcomes began to diverge in a way that no one could explain with conventional logic. The money was no longer arriving where it was supposed to. It was being routed through intermediate endpoints, not listed in the approved configuration, and, more importantly, those routes were not being flagged as anomalous. When the engineers began to dig deeper, they found no errors. They only found that a part of the transaction's journey was being obscured in a way that none of their tools could fully display, making it impossible for them to trace the entire path of the funds. At first, no one mentioned a specific number, because the discrepancies were sporadic and not yet large enough to cause a panic. But as data from multiple processing clusters was pieced together, a pattern began to emerge, growing clearer with each passing second. In less than an hour after the system reset, the total value of untraceable transactions had surpassed $12 million. It wasn't one lump sum that vanished all at once. It was hundreds of small transactions, each one deviating by only a tiny fraction, enough to avoid immediate attention. But when added together, they formed a massive current of money flowing out of the system through routes that no one in the room could control. And the most terrifying part wasn't that the money had left the system. It was that it was still moving, along paths that left no clear trail, and no one in the room knew exactly where it would stop if they couldn't intercept it in time. What happened next was no longer contained within an internal system. Because when money starts moving through untraceable routes, its consequences don't stop at the dashboards in a control room. They ripple outward, touching the lives of people who depend on everything working exactly as they've always believed it would. In the small office of a tech startup, where every dollar was tightly budgeted to survive, month to month, a payroll of nearly $2 million had been sent out early that morning. Its status showed processing, just like always. But as time passed with no confirmation of completion, the money had left their account but hadn't appeared on the receiving end. Every minute of waiting turned into pressure as the management team realized they couldn't answer a very simple question from their employees. Where is our pay? At a retail store, where hundreds of small transactions make up an entire day's revenue, customer payments were stuck in a pending state. Money was deducted but not confirmed. The system reported no error, but it didn't complete the transaction either. For the store owner, the fear wasn't just the immediate loss of money, but the fact that he no longer knew if he could trust any transaction that was happening. In the boardroom of an investment fund, where every number is meticulously controlled, over $4 million could not be reconciled between systems. Reports didn't match, and urgent calls were being made non-stop as they tried to determine if this was a technical glitch or a sign of a much bigger problem. And what made the voice on the other end of the line change wasn't the number itself, but the fact that no one could explain exactly why it was happening. Back in the operations center, signals from the outside world began feeding back into the system. Every call, every abnormal transaction, every minor discrepancy was another piece of evidence that the problem was no longer within their internal control, and when it was all laid out, a single truth became clearer by the minute. The money wasn't just being misdirected, it was leaving the very points that were supposed to contain it, and it was doing so without leaving a clear path. The value of what was happening was no longer the total amount of money affected, but the real-world consequences it was creating. The employees waiting for paychecks they couldn't receive, the merchants who couldn't finalize sales, the investments the other side couldn't confirm. All of it began to create a pressure that no spreadsheet could fully capture. In finance, money isn't just a number. It's a promise. It's trust. And when money begins to move in unexplainable ways, the first thing that breaks isn't the system. It's the trust in that system. The engineers continued their trace, digging deeper into the data, trying to find a common thread, a clear sign, a specific bug that could be fixed. But the deeper they went, the more they realized that what they were facing wasn't behaving like a typical attack. There were no signs of a massive withdrawal. No accounts were being wiped clean. There was no clear focal point. Instead, transactions were being rerouted, scattered, appearing and disappearing from logs in unpredictable ways, as if someone was quietly testing every small door in the system to see which ones would open without making a sound. Then a realization emerged, not from an official alert, but from the behavior of the data itself. They weren't taking the money yet. They were testing how they could take it without being detected. In that moment, the danger of the situation doubled. Because if what was happening was just a test, then whatever it was preparing for wouldn't stop at $12 million. And what everyone in that room understood better than anyone was that if they didn't stop it right now, the next time it wouldn't be a test. As the pressure in the control room began to shift from tension to controlled panic, Laura no longer stood at the command post. She took a step back, not to evade responsibility, but to look at everything that was happening from a different perspective. And it was in that moment that she requested access to everything Daniel had left behind before he was removed from the system. The log files, the short notes, the unofficial code snippets, all of it was opened at once. It wasn't neatly organized like an internal report. It was fragmented, hurried, bearing the marks of someone trying to document the most critical things before running out of time to explain them fully. And the more Laura read, the more she realized that this wasn't a new incident. It was something that had existed before. It had been seen, it had been monitored, but it had never been properly understood. At the end of one file, there was a single line separated from the rest, not long, but unmistakably clear. This isn't a system issue, it's a timed breach. Laura paused on that sentence, not because she didn't understand it, but because she finally saw the situation for what it really was. This wasn't just a technical error that needed fixing. It was a pre-programmed process, triggered exactly when it was meant to be. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't carelessness. It was something designed to wait. And now it had begun. In that moment, what was playing out on the screen in front of her was no longer just a series of faulty transactions. It was real money flowing out of the system along routes that no one in the room could fully track. Not for a lack of tools, but because parts of the path had been intentionally obscured. $12 million wasn't just a recorded figure. It was a stream of money that kept moving, without leaving a clear trail. And it wasn't stopping. Laura felt a profound shift in her understanding. The system hadn't failed. It was being guided. This wasn't about fixing a mistake anymore. It was about trying to stop something that had already gained its own momentum. And right then, she realized her mistake wasn't just one single decision, but the entire chain of events leading up to it. She had seen Daniel, slumped over his desk, and dismissed it as a disciplinary issue. She had cut him off before he could even finish a sentence. She had revoked his access as quickly as she possibly could, and by doing that, she had accidentally stripped away the only layer of control that was keeping the money from sliding out of sight. It wasn't a hacker who triggered the system. It was a human action that did it. While everyone else was still hunting for a specific bug to fix, Laura saw what they hadn't yet realized. The problem wasn't that the system was broken. The problem was that it was still working, but, according to a logic they no longer controlled. And what made this moment feel so heavy wasn't how much money they had lost. It was that the money was still moving, and not a single one of them knew where it would end up. The apartment was on the top floor of an old, unremarkable building. From the outside, the faint yellow light from the small window was enough to show someone was home, but not enough to make anyone stop and look. As Laura stood before that door, everything from the control room was still vivid in her mind, but the feeling changed the moment she stepped into a space without screens or data, just real life. Ethan opened the door, staring at her for a few brief seconds as if trying to figure out who she was and why she was there. Then he stepped back to let her in. No questions, no surprise. Just a simple acceptance that something was happening that he didn't fully understand but didn't want to stop. Inside the apartment, the dining table still had leftovers. A bowl of cold rice, a spoon lying lopsided as if someone had stopped mid-meal. On the table was an open notebook with unfinished math problems. The numbers just stopped in the middle of a page, not erased or corrected, just left behind like a task interrupted. Daniel was lying on the sofa, slumped to one side. His laptop was still open next to him, the screen glowing with the same data streams Laura had just left. No one was touching it, yet it kept running at its own pace. In that state, he didn't look like he was resting. He looked like someone who had stopped, because he simply had no other choice. One shoe was still on his foot, the other was on the floor. His shirt was wrinkled from a long day. All these small details came together into a picture that required no explanation. What was happening in the system was inseparable from the life of the person standing before it. Ethan went back to the table and picked up his spoon, but he didn't eat. His eyes kept flicking toward Daniel out of habit. Not out of sudden worry, but because he was used to seeing his father like this. That sense of normalcy made Laura realize just how much she had overlooked. She asked softly, not to dig for info, but just to find a way to start. She asked when Daniel had gotten home. Ethan told her. His dad hadn't been back long, saying he had something to take care of before he could rest. His voice was casual, like this was something that happened all the time. Then he looked at Laura. No hesitation, no attempt to make it sound more important. He just repeated what he'd heard, the way a child remembers things that feel meaningful. He said if he doesn't fix it, people might lose something they can't get back. The words were spoken softly, which is why they didn't feel like a prepared warning, but like a quiet truth. In that moment, all the numbers in the system, all the untraceable transactions, all the $12 million out of control, none of it was abstract anymore. It became about real people. People who would never know why their money vanished from where it was supposed to be. Laura looked at the glowing laptop. The data kept running without anyone watching. For the first time since this started, she didn't see it as a technical problem to solve, but as something that had bled out of the digital world and into the lives the system was built to serve. In that small apartment, there were no loud noises, no obvious tension, just a silence where everything seemed to stand still for a few seconds. But that silence was where the entire meaning of the story changed. It wasn't about a system being wrong anymore. It was about a flow of money that could take away things people could never get back, and none of the victims would ever know where it started. It took a few seconds after Ethan finished speaking for Laura to return to what she came for. Not to explain or apologize, but to face the only person who had seen this coming. When she called Daniel's name, he didn't snap awake like someone ready to jump back to work. He opened his eyes slowly, as if his body still hadn't caught up with everything around him. He sat up and looked at Laura. No shock, no big reaction, just a brief pause where he realized everything was unfolding exactly as he had feared. When Laura spoke about the system, the untraceable trades, the money sliding out of their hands, he didn't ask questions. What she was saying only confirmed what he already knew. In that small room, there was no rush, no race like in the control room. Just a silence heavy with things left unsaid. And in that silence, Daniel spoke one short sentence. Not loud, not angry, but enough to put the whole story into perspective. I tried to warn them. The sentence needed no explanation. It held everything. The signs he saw, the reports he tried to make, the moment that morning when he was cut off mid-sentence. In his voice, there was no demand for justice. He just sounded like a man who had passed the point where talking would change anything. Laura didn't argue. She didn't make excuses. She knew any explanation would be pointless. All that remained was a choice she couldn't force, and for the first time since this started, the power to decide was no longer hers. Daniel pulled his laptop closer and opened it, watching the rows of data continue to stream. He didn't look panicked. Instead, he was focused with a sharp, clear intensity. It was as if the most disciplined part of his mind was still firing, even though his body was nearing its limit. After only a few seconds, he closed it. Not because he didn't understand, but because he understood enough to know exactly how far things had gone. He glanced over at Ethan and asked a few simple questions about dinner and homework. They were mundane questions, completely unrelated to the chaos unfolding, yet they felt necessary in a different way. It was as if he were trying to keep one part of his life from being swallowed by the storm outside. Ethan answered calmly, without pushing or asking questions, just standing there, as a steady presence in the choice Daniel was about to make. Only then did Daniel turn back to Laura. This time, his voice was steadier. Not just an observation, but something that had to be said before he decided what to do next. If this continues, it won't stop at money. The statement wasn't just about the $12 million moving out there. It was about the nature of what was happening. When a financial system loses control like this, the damage doesn't stop at numbers you can count. It ripples out into delayed decisions, broken promises, and people suffering consequences they can't even trace. In that moment, Laura realized this was no longer about saving a system or a company. It was about stopping a ghost-like flow of money before it created a wake of destruction that no one could undo. And what made this choice so hard wasn't whether Daniel could come back or not. It was that he had every reason not to do it, after everything that had happened. But if he didn't step in, none of them could. When Daniel stepped back into the command center, he didn't need an introduction, and there was no time for formalities. The chaos on the screens said it all. Over $12 million was drifting through untraceable routes, and every passing second meant more of that money was slipping further out of their reach. Daniel didn't ask what happened in the usual way. He stared straight at the data streams, demanded full system access, and started with the only question that mattered. Which routes was the money taking to leave no trace, and which parts of the architecture were still being exploited? The engineers scrambled to feed him data, processing clusters, endpoints, diverted transactions. Daniel pieced it all together in his head, in a way only someone who had truly built it could. He wasn't looking for a single bug. He was mapping out the entire trajectory of the flow. He identified the exploited routing paths and the midpoints where transactions were being redirected before vanishing from sight. Instead of a knee-jerk reaction to block everything at once, he ordered them to isolate specific sections, boxing the money into a tighter space so they could watch and control it without losing the trail entirely. As he tracked the funds, he began shutting down invalid endpoints one by one. He was careful to ensure that each change didn't create a new vulnerability, and that every command was reversible. In a system where the logic had been compromised, one reckless move could make everything worse. He assigned another team to rebuild the primary processing routes, restoring the layers of control he had established before. But this time, he placed them within a structure the whole team could understand and maintain, so it wouldn't just depend on one person anymore. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly from scattered panic to high-intensity focus. Everyone followed Daniel's lead, even if they didn't see the full picture yet. In a very short time, the flow of money began to slow. It was no longer moving freely, but it wasn't fully under control yet. Then, a dangerous moment. An engineer misread a signal from a cluster and executed a sync command. Under normal circumstances, it would have been harmless, but now it opened a brief window, just enough for a group of transactions that hadn't been fully isolated to slip past the newly built defenses. For a few heart-pounding seconds, a portion of that money surged out through the route they'd just discovered. The numbers on the screen ticked upward, making everyone in the room realize they were still standing on a razor's edge. Daniel caught it instantly. He killed all running commands, reversed the operation, and hard-locked the routing path before it could spiral into a massive chain of transactions. That reflex alone kept the money from sliding out of control at the most critical moment. After that near failure, every move became more precise, slower, but certain. Route by route, they locked it down. Transaction by transaction, they brought the data back into visibility, pulling the money back into a range the system could actually handle. When Daniel finally confirmed the abnormal flows were isolated, that no more transactions were moving through untraceable routes, and that all that remained was cleanup, the air in the room changed again. It wasn't total relief, but a heavy pause after surviving the danger zone. And in that silence, they all realized that if they had been just a few minutes slower, or if that one mistake hadn't been caught in time, that $12 million wouldn't have stopped there. The emergency meeting was called immediately after the system was secured. It wasn't just a standard debrief. It was a moment where everyone was forced to face what had happened head-on. There were no polished reports or corporate buzzwords to soften the blow. Just the raw numbers, and the fact that over $12 million had nearly vanished because no one in that room had stopped it from the start. The data was presented quickly. Listed transactions, recovered funds, and what was still being processed. When laid out side by side, It wasn't just a technical glitch anymore. It was a sequence of decisions that had led to a clear disaster. A few people started talking, using familiar jargon to describe the situation. System complexity, process gaps, unforeseen variables. Everything they said was true to an extent, but it missed the real point everyone was actually thinking about. Laura listened to it all without interrupting. When the room finally fell silent, waiting for a conclusion, she stood up. She didn't look at the screens or the documents. She looked directly at the people sitting in front of her. She spoke slowly, making sure every sentence was clear, not for effect, but to ensure not a single word was misunderstood. This morning, I fired Daniel Reeves before I even let him finish a single sentence. No one interrupted, no one reacted. Everyone knew exactly where that opening statement was headed. I made a decision based on a snap judgment, and I ignored a critical warning at the exact moment it needed to be heard most. She paused for a beat, letting the weight of her words sink in. That decision led to us losing the only layer of control that was keeping the money from sliding out of the system. What happened afterward wasn't a surprise. It was the direct result of us failing to see what was right in front of us. There was no attempt to sugarcoat the situation or shift the blame. That raw honesty made the room go quiet in a completely different way. I take full responsibility for that. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was firm enough that there was no room for interpretation. In an environment where mistakes are usually buried in corporate speak, seeing someone in her position own it without conditions changed the entire energy of the room. Laura didn't look to Daniel for validation, nor did she try to make her apology a personal moment. She kept it professional, a necessary admission so the rest of the organization could finally look at how they operated. We watched over $12 million move without a trace. That didn't happen because our system was weak. It happened because we didn't listen to the right person at the right time. She sat down after she finished, not dragging it out. In the silence that followed, no one needed to say anything else to understand that this story didn't end with a fixed system. It ended with the realization that they had almost let a fortune slip away in a way no one could stop. At the end of the table, Daniel said nothing. He didn't nod, he didn't protest. He just sat there as a member of the meeting. He wasn't the center of attention. He wasn't looking for credit. He was just a man who had done his job and didn't need words to prove it. And it was that silence that made the moment feel complete. It didn't turn the story into a cheap, happy ending. It kept it real, a lesson paid for with a massive flow of money that had truly spiraled out of control, large enough that it couldn't be ignored, and clear enough that it could never happen again. The meeting ended without applause, or a sense of total relief. People just stood up and left the room slower than usual, as if everyone was carrying a piece of what had just happened, and they weren't quite ready to put it down. The systems stabilized, and transactions slowly returned to normal. The numbers on the screen settled back into their familiar patterns, but the real change wasn't in the data. It was in how everyone looked at it. They were no longer just automated processes. They were fragile things that could drift off course at any moment if the person behind them wasn't listening closely enough. Later that evening, as most of the staff had already headed home and the office lights dimmed, Daniel walked out. No one stopped him, no one called his name, and he didn't look for anyone to say a final word to. It was as if what needed to be done was finished, and the rest didn't require an explanation. He didn't go back to his old didn't check his email, and didn't look back at what had just unfolded. He walked straight out into a city that kept moving as if $12 million hadn't just shifted through the systems without leaving a single trace. At a small soccer field nearby, the game was nearly over. A few parents had already left, while some kids were still running across the grass. In a corner of the bleachers, Ethan sat there, no longer staring at the gate like he had been at first, but still glancing over every now and then, a habit he couldn't quite break. Daniel was late. He wasn't on time. He didn't keep his promise, but he still showed up. Ethan saw him. He didn't say anything right away. He just stood up, grabbed the ball, and ran over. In that moment, there were no questions, no accusations, just a slight nod, a silent acceptance that sometimes things don't go the way you want, but it's still enough to keep going. In the distance, the city lights stayed bright. Money continued to flow through systems that most people will never see, and the lives of thousands still depended on things they believed would always work exactly as they should. But there are moments when things don't work right, and there are people who, without them, no one would realize it until it was far too late. Laura stood alone in the dark office. She didn't open any more reports or call any more meetings. She just looked down at the trading floor, where everything had returned to normal. For the first time, she wasn't trying to control it. She was wondering how much she had overlooked before learning how to stop and truly listen. The story doesn't end with who was right or who was wrong. It ends with something much simpler. A decision made too quickly can set millions of dollars in motion in a way no one can control. And the one person who was ignored might be the only one who saw it coming before everyone else. If you've watched this far, perhaps you understand that the problem isn't always the system. Sometimes it's how we choose to listen, and sometimes the most important thing comes from the person we never thought we needed to hear. Thank you for staying until the end of this story. In a world where everything is measured in numbers, sometimes the most important things aren't found in the value of money, but in how we see the person standing behind those figures. If this story made you think differently, even just a little, then your time wasn't wasted. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, stay tuned to the channel, because sometimes the most memorable part isn't what happened, but what we learn from it afterward. I'll see you in the next story.